Good day, philosophers. Here we once again begin another week in our Introduction to Philosophy class. And this week we're going to begin by reading Nicomachean Ethics, Book 3, Chapter 1. And the fundamental question of this chapter is the question I posed to you in a discussion board. And if we had class, we'd have a nice little talk about it. But this question, when is a person not responsible for an action? And you can have all kinds of responses here. But I've heard all kinds of things being said. For instance, I've heard that people are not responsible, first of all, if they did not do the action, if someone didn't do it, right? If you simply didn't do the action, then how can you be responsible for it? I've also heard people say people like children aren't responsible for actions, right? Or sometimes even people have some type of mental sort of handicap. People talk about things like that. I've also heard people mention things like, what if someone is drunk, right? Is someone responsible for what they do if they're drunk? Or what if you were sort of like just tricked into doing something, like someone fooled you, or like you were fooled in some ways, right? And are you responsible for your actions then? So these are all a couple different ideas that people might have about when they're responsible. And Aristotle will have a very simple answer to this. When is someone responsible for their actions? Well, Aristotle is simply going to say, we are responsible for all our voluntary actions. If an action is voluntary, then great. Then we're responsible for what we did. But of course, that raises the question, well, what the heck is a voluntary action? Just calling an action voluntary doesn't necessarily explain what it is, right? And so one of the most fundamental things is to realize, before I say anything else, is that voluntary actions really include anything that you do willingly, right? If you do something in some ways willingly, then it is voluntary. This doesn't necessarily have to be chosen, right? It doesn't have to be chosen to be, let me make some more space here. It doesn't have to be chosen. It doesn't have to be the matter of choice. For instance, in some ways, breathing, right? Breathing is something that you do willingly and voluntarily. You can't not breathe, right? And so Aristotle says that it's still a voluntary thing, even if you don't choose it. So it's not always just about what we choose and what we don't choose. But that's not the primary distinction here. That doesn't really reveal to us what the voluntary actions are, because obviously breathing is a voluntary thing. Great. And we are sort of responsible for our breathing, but that doesn't necessarily help us thinking about these things. So Aristotle will, to help us understand what the voluntary is, he'll first tell us what's not voluntary. And in fact, what's not voluntary is fundamentally related to some of the things we mentioned here, right? Aristotle will say that an action is involuntary, right, if the action is itself forced, or if it comes from ignorance. So in other words, if the person doing the action, and that's an interesting thing. When Aristotle refers to actions, he usually talks about the agent, and the agent is really the person, like the acting person, the person who acts, right? The acting person, right? And so when Aristotle says that tries to talk about what's involuntary, he says if the agent is forced in what they're doing, or if they're ignorant of what they're doing, right? And so the voluntary actions will simply be the opposite of this. Someone does an action voluntarily if it's not forced, right? And that means sort of they do it they do it themselves, right? They do the action willingly themselves, like no one is forcing them, and they're ignorant. That means they somehow kind of understand what they're doing, right? And I'm going to jump to towards the end of Book 3, Chapter 1, where we'll see Aristotle sort of say this in his own words after actually a fairly long discussion. We'll read most of it, but we'll see here in Book 1, Chapter 3, I'm using the Irwin translation, the third edition, and so for me it's on page 38. He puts these cute little section numbers in, which are kind of nice. So this is section 20, but if you don't have that, it's like 111A20 or so. So anyways, he says, since involuntary action is either forced or caused by ignorance, voluntary action seems to be what has its principles in the agent himself. So saying what has the principles in the agent himself is the opposite of being forced. So the principle of motion, the action itself is within the agent, right? Knowing the particulars that constitute the action. Right? So a voluntary action, the principle is in the agent, and the agent knows the particulars that constitute the action. They aren't ignorant, right? But this still raises some questions, because we still need to clarify what really counts as a forced action, and what kind of ignorance really gets you off the hook and makes you not responsible for an action. Because there can be plenty of times when someone could say that they didn't know what they were doing, and yet we might still think they're responsible and blameworthy, right? And similarly, just because someone says that they were forced to do something, not all kinds of force are forced in their truest sense. So let's first talk about force. Aristotle might first say, what is a forced action, right? And to help us understand that, he's going to make a distinction between what he calls mixed actions versus truly forced actions, right? And so, all right, if we're going to think about forced actions, let's think about like an example like, say you were being held at gunpoint, right? That might come up as an example of the time that you're not responsible for what you do. What if you're being forced to do it at gunpoint? So is that really the kind of action that is involuntary? Well, Aristotle will say a couple of interesting things about this, right? He's going to say, well, he doesn't really talk about things being done at gunpoint, but he does talk about similar kind of examples. He says that the kind of circumstances that we're thinking about right now are really things when we're acting out of fear, right? We're acting out of fear, usually of like terrible consequences that can come from actions. Now, we don't typically make all of our choices out of fear of terrible consequences. Most of our choices don't necessarily have dramatically terrible consequences to them, right? But here Aristotle talks about them in Book 3, Chapter 1, kind of towards the beginning here. We're at, what is this? 1110A. Why can't I read numbers here? 1110A. And here Aristotle is talking about actions that are done because of fear of greater evils, right? And he says, okay, suppose a tyrant tells you to do something shameful. And when he has control over your parents and children, and if you do it, they will live, but if not, they will die. Well, that sounds like a kind of forced action. He similarly says, what about if you had to throw cargo overboard in a storm? No one willingly throws cargo overboard without qualification, but anyone with anyone's sense throws it overboard to save himself and the others, right? Just as an aside, this is kind of an interesting situation where Aristotle uses dialectic as a kind of method here. We look at these interesting appearances, these interesting kind of opinions we have about what might be called forced, and he's trying to figure out what forced really is by looking at some of these conflicts. But Aristotle ultimately say here that these things are mixed. He says, for at the time they are done, they are choice-worthy, and the goal of an action accords with the specific occasion. So here's the interesting thing, right? When you might do something that a tyrant tells you to do because they're threatening your family, not because you would typically want to do that, but because you're afraid, right? And you know that there's a terrible circumstance, and that might actually make it a voluntary action. He says mixed actions are more like voluntary actions. They're a mixture of what's voluntary and involuntary. So it's essentially what we're talking about here is when you're going to do something that you wouldn't typically do, right? A mixed action, right? You do what you typically, right? You typically would not do. Typically would not do, right? But you do it willingly. In this instance, even though it's something you typically wouldn't do, just because of the situation, just because of the circumstances, right? There's something unique about these particular circumstances that makes something that you would typically never do become something that you're willing to do, right? And that's ultimately what Aristotle means by a mixed action, right? Actually, if here we go here, still in Book 3, Chapter 1, now we're around Section 8, if you've got section numbers here, right? He says, but presumably there are some things, oh, excuse me, I'm looking at the wrong line. I want to go down a little bit further. Around section 10, like halfway through. He says, other things are involuntary in their own right, but choice-worthy on this occasion and as the price of these goods, and their principle is in the agent. These are involuntary in their own right, but on this occasion and as the price of these goods, voluntary. So what he's trying to say is there's something that, like, if someone was threatening your family, that would be involuntary in its own right. It's something that you would not do, but now it becomes choice-worthy to do just in this circumstance. He's going to call that mixed and therefore not truly forced. So what really is forced? If something being like held at gunpoint essentially is not going to truly be forced because you'd be willing to do something just because of these circumstances, well, being forced, it would be more like something like this. He says that a forced has an external principle, the sort of principle in which the agent, or rather the victim, contributes nothing, right? And that's the idea. It says if, for instance, the wind or people who have him in their control were to carry him off. Okay? So in this instance, again, it's the person shouldn't really be considered a true agent, but rather almost as a victim. And that's an interesting, powerful word in this instance, right? So a truly forced action is you don't contribute anything. It's like if you're driving in a car and all of a sudden, something breaks in the car and it's not under your power anymore, and then you get into an accident. In that sense, you were forced. You had no power and control in that situation anymore, right? That's a forced action, right? And so there you go. So a voluntary action is the complete opposite of that. It's when the principle of acting is within the person, right? So the opposite of something being forced, and let me clarify this some more, the opposite of something being forced is where the principle of action, right, is in the agent, right? All right, so let's take a quick pause here, and we're going to pick up talking now about ignorance and what ignorance really is in just the next video. So hang tight. Catch you on the flip side.